You know, Rebels, if you've been checking out some of my promotional ads on social media, you will be aware that I have been using a lot of AI programs to help me create ads. But you know what? There's a lot more uses for AI than just funny little videos. And I'd like to introduce one of our new sponsors, Podium. It is a leader in creating AI tools for podcasters. Now, let's say you've got a podcast, or maybe you're even thinking of doing a podcast. You're probably wondering, well, how can AI be integrated with your workflow? I'll tell you about Podium. As a podcaster, you know that writing show notes and creating chapters and transcribing episodes takes a lot of time, and it can cost you a lot of money too. But you know what? That's where Podium comes in. It's an AI tool designed specifically for creators and podcasters with the goal of making post-production tasks quick and easy. And in just a few minutes, Podium generates show notes, chapters, summaries, clips for social media, a full transcript, suggested episode titles, social media posts, and more. Whew, that's a lot of work for one little program. Your show notes are key to your podcast's success because it helps new listeners find your podcast and they'll know if it's a fit for them. You know, kind of like Too Many Podcasts. It also improves your SEO, that's your search engine optimization. Ooh, big phrase there. And overall accessibility. And with Podium, you can focus on creating a great podcast and let Podium's AI do the heavy lifting. But Podium isn't just for solo creators and podcasters. It's a game changer for editors, producers, marketers, agencies, and production studios. Teams that use Podiums are able to increase workloads, decrease turnaround times, and improve their quality. How does it work? Very easy. First, go to Podium's website, and you'll see that link that's right there in the show notes. You get 3 hours free just to try it. Pretty cool, huh? And using that link also supports this show as well. And you know what else happens? Because I'm a good guy. You use my link, you will get 50% off for your first month. So visit the site, upload an MP3 file, and download your files, and that's it. And if you need anything else, you can use Podium GPT to generate articles and any marketing copy you might need in seconds. Instant show notes, transcripts, chapters for your podcast or channel. This will level up that podcast. So check out Podium today.
Too Many Podcasts is brought to you in cooperation with the SJ Network. If you are a person who would like to appear on podcasts, contact Stephen Joyner at s-j-network.com. We now direct you to the Sherpa Chalet, where we will turn it over to Jim the Podcast Sherpa. How he got this job is anyone's guess.
Today's guest on Too Many Podcasts is David Beckemeyer from the Outrage Overload podcast. It's a look at outrage in our society.
My wife told me that when I say something that outrages her, she cleans our toilet.
How does that help her?
Well, apparently, she uses my toothbrush.
Welcome to Too Many Podcasts, the podcast about podcasts. Now, podcasting from the Sherpa Chalet on Mount Podcastia, here's your host, Jim, the Podcast Sherpa.
Hello there, Rebels of the Sherpolution, and welcome to Too Many Podcasts. It is the podcast about podcasts and so much more. Jim, the Podcast Sherpa, coming to you from Sherpaloo Studios in the Sherpa Chalet high atop Mount Podcastia, just to bring you an interview with our guest today.
Who's our guest today, Sherpa?
His name is David Beckemeyer, and he is the host of a podcast called Outrage Overload. And what is it about, you may ask? Yes, it's about outrage. And it's probably a little bit more prevalent in our world, in our society, than you would imagine, especially nowadays, I would believe so. I got to know him and about his show and what's behind all that. And we got to discuss outrage. And I think I will be outraged if you guys don't pay attention to this. It's going to be really good. And also, following that, we will be having, for the first time in a few weeks, some Sherpa Selects. I've been checking out podcasts left and right, so I want to talk to you about some of them as well. So have a listen to my conversation with David Beckemeyer from the Outrage Overload podcast. Hello there, Rebels. We are here in the Outrage room of the Sherpa Chalet, and my guest today is coming to us from San Francisco, the Rice-A-Roni treat or something like that. I don't know. David Beckemeyer, who is the host of the Outrage Overload podcast. It's a podcast about outrage in our society and in media. And this is really interesting stuff. I was checking out his things on his website, the outrageoverload.com. If you want to check that out and hear a lot of his stuff. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jim. My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, how did all this come about? Outrage, it's a very specific topic that goes on, in this world. And I guess it's more prevalent now than it was years back.
Yeah, well, I did want to note real quick that the website is outrageoverload.net instead of .com, but that's okay. Yeah, so I kind of landed on outrage as kind of as a core kind of blanket term for a lot of this kind of emotion and anxiety that's out there. So it's kind of a combination of fear and anger and sort of moral indignation, things like that we kind of experience sometimes, and that there's a lot of players out there sometimes called kind of the outrage industry or the outrage machine or whatever, that the media, politicians, others like to keep us riled up and angry and scared all the time, so kind of makes their lives easier. And social media as well will click stuff and like it and all that. So I kind of centered on outrage as kind of the core term there as sort of a blanket for this sort of range of emotions that they're constantly trying to get us riled up about.
You use a phrase on your website that I'd never seen before called outrage porn. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I really like the term, even though people are like, what are you talking about? But it was first coined by the New York Times, and they kind of use it in the context of social media. And I kind of use it as in a larger context. It goes beyond social media. And I like the two terms together because, like I said, outrage is kind of a blanket term for these emotions like fear and moral indignation and anger. And then the porn part is because we're basically addicted to it, right? We keep going back for more. We click that stuff. That's what we dive into. That's what we want to see. So we may think we don't like it, and we say we don't like it, but if you actually look at our behavior, we're attracted to it. We go to it. That's what we click on. That's what we, get excited about. That's what we tell our friends about. So that's why I like the term, because, it basically captures this notion that there's a lot of that kind of media out there. And then we tend to gravitate towards it and react to it. So there's more of it. It's kind of a vicious cycle.
And your podcast really isn't a political podcast, although discussions of politics are brought up for obvious reasons, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my podcast is kind of a psychology, partly psychology, partly other sciences and disciplines, kind of around what's going on with all this stuff. Like, how does it work? Why does it work? Why do they do it? What's going on with us? Like, why are we like this? Like, what are these tendencies that we have? What are some of these psychological tendencies? So if you're sort of a science nerd and you like that kind of stuff, I talk to, researchers and scientists that have, done work and come up with these things. And some of them are pretty fascinating. Like when you discover what some of these tendencies are and how they work. And you're like, wow, that's crazy. Like, why does our brain work that way?
Yeah. And I guess, when you think about it, that we've probably grown up with the phrase that the emptiest can makes the most noise. And so when do you think that at what point that people were realizing this, that, hey, if we're attracting the most attention here, something's going to happen. Something's going to change, whether it's for good or for bad.
Yeah, for sure. I'm encouraged by the fact that there seems to be more people kind of realizing that this is happening and it's not really good for us. Mm-hmm. You're seeing, there's a lot of groups out there, a lot of organizations kind of identifying these things and kind of looking at ways we might improve the situation. So I'm encouraged by all that. And some people say, some of the experts that have been working in this field and try to improve these things talk about like hitting rock bottom in some way, I guess a little bit like a drug addict or something would. Mm-hmm. Hitting rock bottom, and that might get us to turn things around. And I kind of hope, I don't know what rock bottom is, I guess. I don't know how bad rock bottom has to be, but I guess that's a possibility as well. I'm kind of hoping we can start identifying it in ourselves and start doing more on our own before we get to some kind of rock bottom place, as you say. I mean, right now there are a lot of people that are concerned of where this might lead, right? I mean, sure. First of all, we're already to a point where there's a lot of mental health issues because of this, right? Mm-hmm. And social media is particularly bad, but it's other places as well. But social media is particularly bad for it because a lot of reasons. But it really attracts. There's two parts of it. It pulls in both directions. It really attracts people that are toxic, and there's research about that, and that's kind of fascinating. So a lot of the people you see on social media didn't become toxic because they got on social media. They were toxic before, and then but toxic media gives them this amplifies, gives them a megaphone and lets them sort of take over these spaces. And the other side of it is, like I said, that gives us a misperception of the world. Like we look at social media and think, wow, everybody's really awful, but really it's not true. Like in the comment section of a lot of threads, right? But really it's not true, because you're getting a segment of people that fit that profile, So we're not seeing an example of the real world. We sort of think we are, and then that makes us kind of depressed about the world. And what do? Well, we roll out. Well, if we're the calmer voices, we've all rolled out. So we don't see the calmer voices because they don't want to participate in that conversation. So it just kind of keeps feeding on itself and getting worse. And so, so that's one place where we're already suffering some sort of mental. There's almost like a worldwide, malaise a little bit from all this, and hopefully we'll start to realize that and kind of find ways out of it. But it's hard because you have to look inwardly, and a lot of us don't really want to do that. We want to think it's out there. Somebody else it's out there and they're doing it to us. But in reality, we have the control in it. But it's hard to sort of recognize that and change our behavior, maybe, not the doom scrolling before bed and all that. Right.
Sure. Do you think that, with the advent of the internet from like the 90s and, and the rise of social media, that all of a sudden became like the gateway for all of these people that were toxic, as you want to call them. Here's my chance. Now I'm going to put a microphone in front of me. I got a keyboard in front of me, and now the whole world is going to hear my manifesto.
Yeah, what the internet did is speed it up and increase the distribution, right? So these kind of things existed before. You had, this, but so as one of my guests said, in Pony Express days, this stuff spread at the speed of horse, right? Well, now it spreads at the speed of light, and that's a big difference. And it goes all over the world really quickly, and something can go viral within minutes, and that wasn't really true. Like something, if it went viral, it was weeks or months or something, right? It took a while, and So that's a big change that the internet has brought, that it spreads faster. And the second big change is really that you can bring these diverse groups together. So everything is a community now. There's a community, and I don't, in good and bad ways, right? You can form a community around some kind of awful criminal behavior, right?
Right.
And that does exist on social media. So, and on the internet in general. So those two things create for a sort of a disruption to the way, our biology kind of hasn't caught up with this technology, right? The technology is way ahead of us and giving us just this massive amount of information and sorting through it and figuring out what's to be trusted and what's not. We're just not really prepared for it because we've never had this access to information. This is one of my big things that I spend time talking to a lot of scientists about is, this whole idea that we have more information and better information than we've ever had, with the internet, right? We have access, we all have an encyclopedia in our pocket. We have access, but somehow like various, odd conspiracies are more popular now than they were before. So, it's some things that are sort of innate in us, and so just having the information doesn't make for a necessarily more well-informed society. And, and drilling down on that is what's really some fascinating, research that we talk about on the show.
Yeah. And when you think about it, even like earlier, we think of like a lot of conspiracy theories and even like a lot of the tabloid journalism that's been around for years, but it never really got to that point where it really kind of overtook society, where now it's almost like it's a part of the machine, really.
Yeah, it was definitely always there, like you say, and it had its fringe element. There were definitely people that fell for that stuff and believed that stuff, and and there's a lot of places where I'm kind of coming, with all the people I've talked to and the experts I've talked to in this space, I'm coming to be careful about words like conspiracy theory, misinformation, disinformation, because they can be weaponized. But some things are pretty clearly, like bad facts, like the whole flat earth thing and things like that, right? This is pretty easy to dispute. And so, and people, there's more people that believe that kind of stuff. And so, so exactly, this stuff was always there, but somehow now it's the same set of psychology. It's just the tools and mechanisms out there, enable it to sort of be more self-destructive, right? And more destructive, because you have bad actors as well, right? Because there are people that are on power trips that like this idea of manipulating people and sort of bringing them into like cult behavior and stuff like that. And they don't really care about the cult, and they don't really care about whatever mission the cult says it speaks for. All they really care about is manipulating people because they just get off on that.
Mm-hmm.
And so those kind of people do exist, and the vehicles for those kinds of people to sort of weaponize all this technology and really do damage is worse than it's ever been. And because we're scared, we're frightened, there's a lot of bad things to worry about. I'm not saying there aren't legitimate concerns out there in the world. We have a lot going on, and people are hurting in a lot of cases. And all that makes us more susceptible to these kind of things, right? And especially and so that situation I talked about before with this kind of whirlwind of information just kind of flying at you, it's very hard to sort out like what is something I should pay more attention to and what is just random nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a really challenging problem for us, just plain old humans trying to get through the day.
Yeah. A while back, I had an interview with a man named Dr. Paul Sutter, who is a cosmologist, and he has a podcast called Ask a Spaceman. So he answers all questions about the universe and everything like that. And one of the things I brought up with him, I said, well, why do these things come about where people believe, the flat Earth theory and that the moon landing was staged and all that? And he said it really just kind of stems from people who just don't want to accept science. It was kind of that, like a flat statement. And I can kind of see that. I mean, they want their own explanation, I guess.
Right. I mean, and that if you keep unpeeling that onion, what you kind of come to find is that it's kind of about trust, and our circles of trust just have gotten tighter and tighter. That we really only trust, people that we know directly, and we're starting to trust institutions less and less. Science being one of those, academia being one of those. And news media and other things being, we're having less and less trust on, and we sort of have fallen into this mode where we think we can decipher everything ourselves, and it's kind of a dangerous situation because, we really can't. But we're really good at fooling ourselves into thinking we can, and that's all part of these cognitive biases that we often talk about on the show. And yeah, it's kind of a challenging situation because. How do you restore that trust? I mean, because in some cases, there are cases where, academia abused something and they deserved, to lose some trust over that. The news media abused something they deserve. And some of these institutions have, lost trust, deservedly so. But there's still a whole lot of good things about the scientific community and the way science works and the whole peer review process and how they check themselves, sort of have an official way to argue, sort of a formalized way to argue and arrive at a good answer. And, to just throw all that away, does really create a problem because most of us just aren't very good at any of that. And we won't have, if we're only trusting our friends and the people we know directly, we won't have anybody that really pushes back very, very good. Right. I mean, it's kind of the bubble problem, the sort of info bubble problem where we all kind of agree, so nobody really pushes back. We think it's great, and we keep going farther and farther, and we also keep isolating ourselves more and more to the people that agree with us.
Yeah.
And anybody that pushes back, we sort of push them out of our network, and so it's not a good cycle, right? You find what you'll be is less and less informed, and but more and more confident that you have all the good information. So it's like a double-edged sword that just keeps you going down a worse rabbit hole.
And we really have to even be careful of the sources that we get it from too. Another previous guest did a movie. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm gonna blank out on it, but it was about these scientists who they went on these interviews about different topics, and these people who did these documentaries took their answers completely out of context to make it appear like they were supporting, maybe the other side of whatever type of argument was going on. And these scientists actually lost their credibility when it was, none of their doing.
Right. I mean, I have a big responsibility as the editor, of my show of how I portray, the evidence and I shouldn't say evidence, but like the research that I present, right. what I cut, what I don't cut, what I choose to, what papers I choose to, talk about and what I don't. So there's a big responsibility there. And I take it really seriously to, sort of check myself on that. My podcast is affiliated with something called the Connors Institute, and it's out of Shippensburg University. And part of their mission is, and I have to subscribe to that mission as well, is disseminating quality information, quality nonpartisan information. And so we take that mission seriously. But yeah, it would be certainly, if I wanted to. I mean, I have hours and hours of content, and I could spin that probably in a lot of directions if I wanted to, right? Through editing and picking and choosing what I, have them say, have them not say. Of course, with AI now, I can have them say whatever I want.
That's absolutely right.
But yeah, I mean, I've heard of that kind of things, but I'm not familiar with the exact documentary you're talking about. But yeah, that's certainly possible. And I take that very seriously, because I don't want to accidentally do that either, because, I have my biases like everybody else does. So I'm always kind of asking my audience and talking to other scholars. And I have kind of a network of scholars with differing opinions that I kind of refer to now and say, hey, am I going too far here, or have I left something out, that kind of thing. And so I really appreciate having those experts that can kind of help me, that come from different perspectives, that can kind of check me a little bit, that I'm not accidentally, because I'm certainly not intentionally going to do it, but I have those same biases like everybody else. I could accidentally do something like that unintentionally. But yeah, it is a burden, because you have editorial control. So yeah, and if you have editorial control and bad intentions, not so good.
Yeah. And like you said, it's also just a matter of context sometimes too. A simplest answer, with something that might be as controversial as, religion or politics, or even, if people discuss Roe versus Wade or homosexuality or what's going on in the Middle East, you may say something and mean it one way, and then there's that one person who's in the audience who said, wait a minute, he really means this. And then all of a sudden you've got 10 people turning on you. It's like, that wasn't what I meant at all. It's just, this is the way you're interpreting what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a challenge, because there's entire sort of language that different factions understand differently. And if you're not aware of that, you might unintentionally, like you say, sort of use this language in a way that you sort of have always used this language maybe this certain way, and you sort of assume everybody kind of thinks that too. But this language has come to mean a certain thing within certain factions, and yeah, that can be a big challenge. And and that's another area that we pursue on the show. Is I talk to sort of I call them practitioners, sort of in this space. It's kind of got a few different labels, but some of the language around what I'm talking about is kind of still evolving. But one way that's referred to as this idea of bridge building organizations. And so a lot of this is sort of teaching people how to have these conversations and doing and practicing it. So you get to practice it. So, I'm a trained moderator with a group called Crossing Party Lines, where they have these conversations, where they, bring in people and you just kind of talk about, issues. But there's other ones like Braver Angels and Living Room Conversations, and there's a group called Starts With Us that's more about depolarization, which is kind of another some of the language about some of these organizations. But yeah, and so to really have these kind of conversations, you almost do have to go practice it, and we're not practicing it very much. I mean, for the one part, we're kind of afraid of it, so we don't tend to want to do it. And we've sort of been told it's not polite to have political conversations or controversial conversations. So we also don't do it with that. So when it does happen, we're really not prepared for it, because we're in our bubbles, right? And when we run into people with these diverse opinions, we're not used to it, because we're so used to everybody kind of nodding along when we say our 5 things. Everybody's yeah. And then you get to the one person that's like, wait, what? and they want to go, no, you're completely wrong. And we don't often, then we really bristle up and we think, oh, that person's bad. And that's part of that's part of what has kind of happened with a lot of the rhetoric that's been going on, and that we keep getting told that if somebody disagrees with us, they're morally bad people. And if they don't agree with us on these 10 things, all 10, then, they're a bad person. And particularly this one, boy, they better not agree on this one thing. They're a bad person. And we have to learn how to get better about that, because, we live in a world with a lot of people with diverse opinions. Like we do not, people that somehow think their side or whichever their side might be is going to somehow dominate like for a long time and by a huge margin. This is just myth. We are extremely divided right now. And we're divided on so many issues, and that's not going away. So we just have to get used to dealing with people and appreciate and respecting that there are people with differing views. And, maybe you can come to common ground, maybe you can't, but, we can't just we can't throw half the country away and think they're racist or they're idiots or they're woke sheep or, this is where we're in danger right now, is that a lot of people are ready to throw half the country away and say they're just bad people. They're not true Americans. They should not, they don't really deserve to be in this country. And we've got to get out of that mode. And that's really what a lot of my podcast is about, both the science about why we go that way. And then, like I say, these practitioners and others. I kind of got a little heavy there. Maybe I went too heavy there.
That's okay. No, well, actually, it's interesting that you bring that up, because you notice that even like in a lot of these heavy discussions, whether it be on a political show or just a regular news show, you never really hear the words, we're just going to have to agree to disagree on that, where at least it kind of says, you've got your opinion, I've got mine. Let's leave it at that. And that doesn't happen. Now it's like, no, my opinion is better than yours, or,
right.
Or whatever direction that's going to go in.
Yeah. And that's a lot of that is that we've separated more and more in many ways. Geographically, we're living, with people that think more like us, and we're associated with them online. And so we're just, we're really, sort of bubbling up, and keeping ourselves in our little safe bubbles. And that, and again, because, we have to also remember that, I'm kind of a political junkie and I pay attention to all this stuff, but most of the world doesn't, right? I mean, they're kind of doing their own thing, but they might find themselves all of a sudden in the middle of an issue that kind of has popped up into their radar and into their circle, into their world. And so you can find yourself, even if you're not really sort of a political junkie, you can find yourself kind of in the middle of all this. And I think a lot of people discovered that, during like the COVID lockdowns and all that. There was that, I think, brought, a lot of these tensions, to the surface.
Yeah, even with with the virus itself, really. And all of a sudden, people were taking sides over a vaccine. Well, you never really had that in history before. People were just like, okay, let's do it. Let's take our chances. Now it was just people were dead against it, or saying, well, I'm going to do it. And there really wasn't any gray area.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of gray area. The gray area is kind of the problem that we're in now, is right.
It's getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and the reality is the real world is pretty gray most of the time, right? But it's an uncomfortable thing to sort of say that and appreciate it and accept it, because we're biologically set up to want things to be nice and simple, black and white. There's good and evil, and and it just didn't. And also, I mean, Hollywood, everything, every Hollywood movie has a clear evil. Oh, not every, but most has a clear good guy, a clear bad guy. All that kind of stuff. And so we're really, sort of trained to look at the world that way. And in real life, everything, probably your favorite three heroes have a lot of questionable attributes about them, right?
Right.
Three heroes you have. That old line about don't meet your heroes. It's pretty true if you've ever kind of been through that. And we have to accept that everybody, whether it's our hero or our villain, is not as clear cut as that, right? There's probably good parts about them. They're probably a little bit more of an enigma, right? There's some good, really great things about them. There's probably some not so great things about them.
What would you suggest are a couple of steps that people should really take to kind of narrow down that gap? Is there a way that people can really come together? I mean, apart from respect.
Yeah, I mean, respect and I mean, in terms of having these conversations, I mean, our show is great for that because we have a lot of folks come on and talk about that. But a lot of that starts with listening and really being sort of intentional about listening and not trying to persuade anybody. It maybe never, but certainly not at the beginning of a conversation or not for the first, few conversations. If you want to have a conversation like that, and so that's a biggie, is really listening and learning how to appreciate that people can come to different conclusions, even if they have the same set of facts. And, and there are situations where we kind of have different facts a little bit, but you can still, respect people, how they arrived, where they arrived. And, they're not necessarily dumb. They don't have everything. They're not crazy. They're just like you. They use the same kind of a brain to do the same kind of things that you do to arrive at your conclusion. They just arrived at a different conclusion. So that's a first step, is being more, being ready to listen and appreciate and respect other people. I think in terms of, like, if you're stressed out about sort of the environment in general, I think a lot of it is taking a step back I call it looking at the world with this outrage lens a little bit. Like it's kind of an inoculation. If you sort of remember that there's a lot of players out there that are kind of trying to get you upset, even people that, and sources that claim to sort of be on your side, whatever your side might be.
Sure.
In fact, those are the ones you need to pay more attention to, right? They're also trying to rile you up and call out when they do it, or just be sort of inoculated to it because they're going to plan to do it. So when they say this kind of thing that sounds a little, wow, that I'm really mad now about this. They tell me this terrible thing that somebody did. That's what you'll often hear. Mm-hmm. The first step would be the fact that I'm mad means I need to like step back for a second and kind of think about this. Is there more to this story? Like maybe there's more to this story. Like they're just telling me the part that really hits to the base emotions and all that. And if I look into this more, I might discover that, yeah, okay, this thing was kind of there, but really there's also this part to it and there's that part to it. And I don't agree with it, but, I have to be a little careful falling into this instant outrage. Like I'm instantly morally outraged. And if you're finding yourself like that, you're probably not getting the full story. So then, so then there's the issue you talked before about sources, and it's similar to what I was saying earlier that, we live in a world where we have some of the best journalism ever. And so, people that complain about the media and journalism, there actually is great journalism out there, but there's also some fishy stuff, and trying to tell the difference can be kind of challenging, and also, even a good publication, like, you could say, okay, the New York Times maybe leans more left, but they're still doing good journalism. And you can always contrast that with maybe something like the Wall Street Journal, which leans more right. And so both of those are pretty good news organizations when they're doing news stories, but often they're doing opinion stories. And it's not always as easy to, you can kind of see it often says opinion at the top, but your brain often doesn't always see that, So the opinion stories don't have to sort of comply with the same journalistic standards as the actual news stories do. So often the stuff that's going to get you the most riled up is probably an opinion story, or maybe it's a news story that didn't go far enough, you think, right? Because you want that riled up stuff. So, if you look at, if I was to name sort of 5 news sources, it would be like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, AP, and then your favorite partisan one, maybe, right? Throw that in. But if you mix a diet of some of those main players, Reuters and AP being the most or the least partisan, but also kind of the most boring because they're just telling you the facts, right? And so they can be boring. And the New York Times is going to lean left. The Wall Street Journal is going to lean right. So, if you just start there, you're in a pretty good place for good news content. There's also sources, there's like Ad Fontes and others that will sort of check a source and tell you a little bit about their reliability and their biases. So that can be a good way to sort of double check. And, if you find a source that seems a little fishy, you can look at those tools like Ad Fontes and others and see where they kind of lie on the reliability and the bias scale.
I'm going to ask you a question that I promise not to get outraged over. What podcast do you like to listen to when you're not working on your show?
I rotate around, but I do often find myself falling back to Radio Lab. You probably know that one.
Sure.
That's an NPR show. And then there's when we're traveling in the car, we often listen to true crime podcasts. Mm-hmm. And there's one called 1 Minute Remaining from a guy in Australia. And it's basically, he talks to people that are incarcerated and then, kind of lets them tell their story. Particularly if they think, I guess everybody in jail thinks they were railroaded or whatever, right? But mm-hmm. he'll go down that story with them and kind of follow, and in many cases, he's got somebody with some legitimate claim, and sometimes he'll follow that case long enough where they got an appeal or they got their sentence overturned or something. So he talks to them in prison, and that's why it's called 1 Minute Remaining, because the little recording thing when you're talking to them on the phone at some point says 1 minute remaining. So that's a good little show. I like that one, but mostly when we're traveling in the car.
That's an interesting one. I've never heard of that one. Now we have a portion of the show, and it's called Shameless Self-Promotion. This is where you can let everybody know where they can follow up on the Outrage Overload podcast.
Shameless self-promotion. Shameless self-promotion.
Yeah, well, you can pretty much find everything if you start at outrageoverload.net, because that has all my socials and everything else. But I'm also at Outrage Overload on Instagram and Twitter/X and Facebook. So you can also start there. But the outrageoverload.net website has pretty much everything. So it has the episodes plus my contact info. And you know how podcasters love to hear from real people. So my email is outrageoverload@gmail.com. So I listen to everybody. There's also a speak pipe on the homepage. If that's the thing where you can send me a message, and a recorded message. I love to get those too. So, I love to hear from real people. So yeah, that's the best place to start, right there at outrageoverload.net.
Okay, there you have it. And this is Mr. David Beckemeyer of the Outrage Overload podcast, outrageoverload.net. There we have it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Good speaking with you, Jim.
Now it's time for Sherpa Samples. If you've got a podcast you'd like us to sample, contact us, and we'll mention your name on the show.
It is time once again for Sherpa Samples, and it is when I get to talk to you about what's going on the podcast charts. You want to know about some podcasts? Well, you've come to the right place right here on Sherpa Samples. Let's kick it off with Money Stuff. That is a podcast that is hosted by two writers who work with the Bloomberg Financial website, and they talk about a lot of financial issues and money stuff. Hey, hence the title. It's not too much of a money advice show, but I think they do throw a little bit in there. I really just kind of checked out one episode, and I think they were just kind of getting off the ground. So we will see where that goes. I checked out a few sports-related podcasts, but first, there's one called Sword AF, which is a role-playing game. I guess if you can figure that one out, and it's a bunch of people playing and all different characters, and you know how those go. I don't know too much about the RPGs, role-playing games, but I listened to it just in case you guys were wondering what exactly it might be. Cheap Heat is a podcast about professional wrestling, and it is hosted by a guy named Peter Rosenberg. And in the episode that I checked out, he interviewed WWE champion Cody Rhodes, and he talked about all sorts of stuff going on in the sport and about his history and a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. Pretty interesting if you are a wrestling fan. And there is Stick to Football, and here we go again. It's hosted by a bunch of soccer people because they call it football. But they interviewed in this episode J.J. Watt, who is a professional football player, who I believe owns a piece of a soccer team, and his wife is a soccer player, but he's a football player, and it's called Stick to Football. Did you follow that? I didn't follow that. But I figure somebody's going to make sense out of this one way or the other. So if you are into soccer, aka football, you might want to check out this podcast. Lots of British commentators handling this one, by the way. A bunch of true crime stuff in this edition. Fallen Angels, a story of California corruption. This is an interesting one. It had to do with someone dying in a hotel room of a drug overdose and having a connection to a professor of a prestigious California college. I say. Status Untraced is about the disappearance of a survivalist who traveled all around the world. He, I believe, made a lot of money in technology, sold all of his stuff, and he learned how to be a survivalist. And one day he disappeared, and this is about the search for that missing person. Murder in America is pretty much what it sounds like. It focuses on different states and a lot of different true crime tales of people in different states. And the one that I listened to had to do with a serial killer in the state of Texas. Hopefully they will catch this guy because he sounded pretty terrible, and I don't really want to go into the details of things that he did. The Mushroom Cook, this is a wild one. There's also a podcast called The Mushroom Trial. This takes place in Victoria, Australia, where a woman had some of her in-laws over. I believe there were 4 of them, and she served them beef Wellington, and I don't know if there's mushrooms in them, or a mushroom dish along with the beef Wellington, and 3 of them died, and one of them ended up in the hospital. So was it murder? Was it food poisoning? I guess it really goes into this. And this woman is now on trial, and the mushroom trial obviously is following the coverage of that trial. Wild stuff, wild stuff. Now, if you are not a fan of true crime and you want some fake crime, I can give you some of that too. There's one called Sherlock Co. Now, imagine if Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were around today and had all the modern technological conveniences. That's what the premise is of this podcast. And they were involved in stories based on the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I thought it was a pretty interesting twist because I guess it made them more relatable to people in this modern era. And it's very well written too, with a really clever audio drama. I give these guys a lot of credit who put this podcast out. And lastly, The Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos. And it is a discussion of all things. What else? Happiness. And they talk about what makes people happy and ways that you can become happy. I know one way that you can become happy if I stop talking, and we just head right into the outro. Happy now?
Be a rebel. Follow the show at Sherpolution on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
A very special thanks to David from the Outrage Overload podcast. And thank you so much for listening. And I will be outraged as well if you're not listening and subscribing to this show on your favorite podcast app, or you're listening to us on Sherpolution.com. And I have to tell you a little something about the Sherpolution YouTube page. It hasn't officially merged with my podcast platform that I've been working on. But once it does, I got to tell you, everything will change. Everything will change, because there are certain episodes that people just go crazy over, and they love to listen to it on the YouTube channel, and maybe not so much through their podcast app. And that's okay. You're allowed to do that. I'm not going to hold it against you. But when that happens, everything's going to be different. My most listened to episode will be different. And that, of course, will change the rest of the charts and the most popular stuff. And if you want to hear some of the older stuff, you know what you got to do. Just listen on Saturdays to Sherpa Selects, where we play some of the earlier episodes of Too Many Podcasts. Because, we've hit the 300 episodes, and those of you who are listening on Apple Podcasts may not get to hear those anymore. So what I do is I replay them. I throw them back into the rotation on weekends so you can check them out. And we've just finished, actually, all of the episodes, all of the interviews, rather, from season 1, and we are going into season 2. Season 1 is probably one of my favorites because I guess it was fresh and I had some really incredible guests. But wait till you see what season 2 will bring you. So be sure to check that out as well, if you are so inclined to. But thank you very much for listening here, and I hope to see you next week. And until then, I say to all of you, Viva la Sherpolution!
Thanks for listening to Too Many Podcasts. Please disperse. You can go home now. I said you can go home now. Viva la Sherpolution. Viva la Sherpolution. Oh. Yeah, I'll come back now, you hear?